Okay. Okay, so yeah, I'll get going. So the quote in the title just comes from a paper by Sandra Swart describing animal history's place in African history. And I think it just appropriately kind of describes a similar situation relating to the Scottish Gaeltacht, which I'm going to speak about today. So domestic livestock are central to narratives around agricultural improvement and the Highland clearances in the context of the 18th and 19th century Scottish Gaelic-speaking region, or the Gaeltacht, the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. But the significance of these relationships for communities at the sharp end of widespread land use changes has not been fully explored. Recent scholarship on human-livestock relationships offers theoretical scope, complementing multidisciplinary scholarship on this region that recognise the significance of human-animal relationships as a new lens. So today I'm going to give a couple examples from my own work in progress PhD research, and also offer some thoughts on how animal history on this region's relationship to livestock may impact current movements for sustainable and just community development in the region. So the history of this region in this period is dominated by the Highland clearances, which was broadly the resettlement of communities at the behest of their landowners from inland, communally organised townships or balchan, to coastal crofting settlements, which were individually held crofts. Many of the Gaelic population were permanently displaced, either internally or abroad, and in their place, larger farms were carved out for the grazing of large herds of Highland black cattle and later improved Cheviot and blackface sheep breeds. Critiques, like Tindley on the slide here, have accused the mainstream historiography of a pervasive adherence to political, demographic, economic and elite perspectives and grand narratives, engendering a history devoid of emotion and ignorant of, quote, the lived experience of ordinary men, women and children, and the sort of marginalisation of Gaelic culture. To these critiques, I would also add a neglect of the animals that had been integral to people's lives through interactions such as milking, herding and seasonal transhumance. So references to cattle's historic importance in the Gaeltacht can be found in kind of history from below approaches to the period, which emphasise their overwhelming importance as seen through Gaelic literature and tradition. As the quote from Hugh Cheap on the slide shows, the well-being of Gaelic society could be measured in terms of the state of its stocks of cattle. So a huge importance for different aspects of life going back historically here. So just some cross-disciplinary research on the Highlands and Islands, which has kind of integrated human-animal relations into the web of social interactions permeating Highland communities. Going back to the 70s, Eric Regine suggested that animal husbandry practices such as communal cattle grazing were a means by which communities preserved aspects of communal social organisation in the face of improving imperatives well into the 20th century. And more recently, the quotes on the slide, archaeologist Michael Given highlighted that seasonal transhumance, or known in the Highlands as shealing practice, which is the migration of people and their livestock to upland pasture during the summer, and largely eradicated by the close of the 19th century, had embodied an attentiveness to powers such as animal agency. For example, recognising cattle's need to graze fresh pasture after the sometimes scarce winter, Given argued that embodied movements of people and animals were acts of, quote, placemaking. Robertson and Rivet as well in 2019 recognised the continued performance of certain assemblages of humans and animals tracked through practices such as land occupations and home dairying. So combining this literature with growing animal studies scholarship around human-livestock relationships offers a novel approach to the period, one that enables, I argue, a fuller understanding of how communities experience changes. So it's fairly well established now across multiple disciplines that to see domestic livestock purely in terms of their economic value is reductive. Fudge's research on human-cattle relationships in early modern England recognises that for acknowledging that for communities for whom small-scale livestock husbandry was crucial, the way, to quote, the ways people lived with their animals will tell us much about those animals and about those people and the social and emotional worlds they share. So just as they pay close attention to their animals, we have to too. Jocelyn Portia, working in environmental ethics, encourages a re-evaluation of inevitable shifts from animal husbandry to the industrial livestock industry, defining husbandry as, quote, human work relations with animals that are considered as such, evolving in societies as part of, quote, the set of social relationships in which animals such as cattle participated in the social world of communities as more than just objects. Allowing livestock such as cattle and sheep into historical narratives as actors in their own right, albeit within asymmetrical systems of control, is key, rather than playing into systems of thought which see them as vacuous and unthinking beings. Recognizing, for example, that, to quote Portia and Smith, cows do more than simply function, they invest their intelligence and their affects in the work. So I want to suggest that thinking has kind of developed from anthropological ideas around animal domestication, solely tied to quote, the principle of total human control. So we're kind of moving on from Ingold's ideas from, trust to domination, to make possible, to quote White and Finn, other forms of coexistence, and albeit relationships that embody these kind of asymmetrical power relations all the same. So archaeologist Kristen Armstrong-Omer recognized that social contracts between humans and livestock, in this case in early Bronze Age Norway, encompassed, quote, notions of trust and reciprocity alongside aspects of domination. Indeed, Fudge highlights that human livestock entanglement in early modern England was, to quote, not a world of clear agreement, but a world of ongoing negotiation and tentative collaboration. So it's an important acknowledgement that communities dependent on the health of their domestic livestock for survival, whether economic, physical, social, had a duty of care to varying extents from which lived spaces were conceived of and maintained. But plainly, to quote Fudge again, the needs and desires of their animals had to matter for successful production. So I'm not saying that these insights can be blindly applied to new contexts. That would be reductive in itself, but that the development of scholarship in this area creates new possibilities for theoretical engagement with specific contexts. So the lives of their cattle mattered for the communities I'm studying. I'll now explore some examples from their own research, hopefully highlighting some scope for animal studies. So literary scholars note the dominant presence of cattle rearing motifs in Gaelic Barstoch, or poetry and song. This medium was historically a powerful mode of cultural expression for a largely oral society, and drew on an entrenched system of rhetoric using praise and dispraise. And Bateman notes, as seen on the slide, that in the idealized landscape of classical Gaelic praise poetry, the rightful clan chief's rule is affirmed by the burgeoning of a fruitful land supporting a numerous population, with, quote, the fecundity of deer and the gaiety of family groups of cattle reflecting a well-functioning society. So 19th century Gaelic poetry and song dealing with the clearances highlighted the disruption of these relationships, reflecting, to quote, a fragility as if society lacked any solid foundations. The object of praise, for example, shifted to a reimagined homeland, which embodied, to quote Meek, a set of emotional and moral values which were perceived to be under threat. Significantly, changing human-cattle interactions often appeared at the intersection of social and cultural devastation and ecological catastrophe, to quote Ponkarova's recent article. So I'll give an example here from Oran Donna Keeper and Galda, which is the Song to the Lowland Shepherds, composed in 1798, but republished in 1877 in a periodical and Gale by Alan MacDougall of Glengarry. So the close associations with cattle here are deployed to express social and cultural alienation. We've got words such as "soom" in the end of the second line, which from a 1900 dictionary is kind of consideration, respect, regard, care, and attention. And also the decline of a landscape of cattle raising practices linked to a peopled place, community. So cattle are clearly a component of the social life of Glengarry as envisioned by MacDougall. The poem Elsewhere is a damning indictment of the morally bankrupt economic determinism of incoming sheep farmers, with their conversation being depicted as principally concerning sheep's economic value. It's not that economic value had not mattered in Gallic society around livestock, but a sense that an attentive to the wider aspects of their being was not being respected. It's also significant that the poem framed the changes happening during this period as a clash between two opposing ways of living with animals, or to quote Dick from 2020, as living with rather than owning. But it's important that this literature doesn't kind of reference that it's sort of got these ideas from animal studies, so there's kind of a link to be made here. In this poetic context, place, cultural and social connections are maintained by interactions with cattle. So another key source that I'm looking at are testimonies given to a government commission in 1883 by crofters and cotters. It's quite a significant source, as you can see from the stats here, but it's seldom been used by historians. It's quite remarkable that following on from the poetry, cattle's kind of physiology, productive and reproductive capacities continue to provide a key reference point for a place's capacity to sustain human and non-human life, and this was central to people's grievances. This kind of reveals further that these are relationships which we must take seriously. Important to note that these people were often speaking as spokespersons for their communities, with evidence given in the presence of an audience of local people. Also that the testimonies are mediated into English by translators, and we don't have the original Gallic. So the linguistic aspect there, which I don't really have time to go into now, but is significant. So here we've got John MacDonald on the left here, who complained to the commission that these testimonies suggest that disruptions to human-cattle relationships signified a kind of rupture in people's social and emotional attachment to place. John MacDonald complained to the commission that his community now didn't have enough land, kind of enabling them to rotate pasture and enabling soil regeneration. And in contrast to his father's situation, MacDonald's grazing was, to quote, a place that was never created for the habitation of man. And he accentuates this with, though we have a few cows left us, we cannot take as much out of the ground as would keep them alive. And the other testimony on the screen here echoed MacDonald's. McCaskill's croft is not fit to be used for man nor beast, kept only the life in his cattle, the cows reportedly suffering, quote, more than ourselves, being always half starved with want of grass. McCaskill kind of indicated how this reflected on himself as well, saying we have the name of having cattle, but a stranger would think it incredible that in some cases these cows would have calves once in 3 years. So the link between a place unable to support cattle and it being not fit for human habitation is implied, is quite significant, with comments illustrating how this was kind of disrupting their duty of care to both family and cattle. So the spaces were not created to support this, and cattle's engagement with them often reflected this. The testimonies complement the poetry in highlighting the implicit and explicit connections between cattle health and a place meant to sustain a community. Instances of animal trespass from these testimonies indicate how we may use animal studies to better understand the dynamics of this relationship further. So instances of animal trespass, that's cattle, sheep and deer transgressing the boundaries of crofters and larger holdings, causing damage to arable land and grazing pasture, kind of abound in these testimonies where you've got people on much smaller bits of land, meaning the livestock has much less area to graze. So John Campbell's testimony indicated his stock's tendency to trespass on grazing ground at Hamarivore, which was taken from tenants by the factor around 13 years previously. It seemed as if his stock's kind of volition to trespass had become a defining feature of living at Hamara, constantly reinforcing Campbell's social position and inability to raise stock on his own ground. His stock's desire to seek out sustenance on land, which their kind of animal ancestors may have even been familiar with, was being thwarted constantly by the landowner MacDonald's claim to private property. Also a written statement here presented by Malcolm Nicholson emphasised his stock's inability to survive on their meagre hill pasture, claiming that, quote, they are forced to trespass when they have hardly anything to eat on their own ground. So these instances suggest, respectively, that crofters' cattle may have co-constituted claims to land, not only by enacting their kind of natural volition to satisfy their need for sustenance and being permitted to do so, them doing this would ultimately benefit Nicholson as he would have healthier cattle, but also possibly by recognizing their capacity for remembering certain areas and movements to and from those areas. This would have been important to practices such as transhumance, and accounts of this practice in this region often note this. Various land disputes and land raids by crofters on disputed grazing areas during the 1880s and stretching back to the 18th century and well into the 20th involved livestock, and Cameron's noted how people driving their cattle onto bits of land signified a permanence key to assertions of land rights in the Gaeltacht. And a surveyor testifying to the same commission also noted that in the case of Ben Lee in Skye, that it would be, quote, a difficult matter to keep crofters' stock off Ben Lee, and sort of suggesting that they should be given back this land because of the animals' tendency to trespass. So I want to bring in Fudge's use of tentative incorporation of modern animal welfare science approaches to historical practice, and it enabled us to perhaps to recover a sense of animals that have been marginalized by mechanistic thinking. Using Remelsfelder's qualitative behavioral assessment, for example, calls on, quote, observers to recognize animals as agents who live in sequential time, capable of remembering, of responding to the world, to each other and to other beings in it, and able to change the world to reflect their own desires. This potentially expands our understanding of both of the way people in the past worked with their animals and of how we might interpret those animals' behaviors. The instances of trespass presented above seem to indicate that these crofters were attentive to their cattle's skills and competencies insofar as it legitimized and reinforced claims to land. So to close, the animal studies literature also kind of compelled me to think about now, in other words, kind of why does it matter? In 1955, ecologist Fraser Darling linked ecological devastation caused by industrial sheep grazing in the Highlands to social and cultural decline, and that ecological regeneration would rely in part on the reintroduction of Highland breed cattle in a way that accounted for their competence in becoming familiar and already being suited to the Highlands. And current conservation grazing efforts, kind of mentioned by John yesterday, in Lewis, they kind of recognize this fact. In Lewis, for example, the Galson Estate Trust is working with the RSPB and local crofters using no fence technology, which are kind of these collars, which means you can set the boundaries of grazing on your phone, on an app, on Highland breed cattle, to kind of create habitats for corncrakes and nurture wildflower meadows. And crofter Dol McSween noted how this benefited him by giving him more grazing for his cattle, and also noted his choice of, to quote, a nice calm family unit for the task, saying that they all have a nice disposition, so will hopefully be easy to work with. Also in a film featuring young crofters on Skye, there's a couple of stills from it here, Dan Fianus. Similar conservation grazing was being considered. Bringing Highland cattle back was framed as, quote, diversification, which is, to quote, kind of ancient and a sort of common sense thing to revitalize ecosystems in uplands. So there's interesting emphasis here on the fact that this conservation relies on Highland breed being adapted to this particular landscape over centuries, acknowledging their relationship to it and the connections they can nurture by being there and working with others. That's, you know, other non-humans as well. There's also an acknowledgement of the heritage of this. I think this dialogue between past and present is important, obviously employed to suit a specific need for the Highlands now and an appetite for ecological regeneration, but that paying attention to animals' competencies within this kind of makes sense. So yeah, the state of the field, if you'll pardon the pun, which I think I've avoided fairly well, this is a small yet significant corner of the field. I hope to have highlighted how current animal studies scholarship around human livestock relationships provides a vital new lens through which to explore how communities in the late 19th century Scottish Gaeltacht experienced land use changes, and also encourages us to think about the contemporary relevance of that. So thanks for listening.
Fantastic. Our next speakers, I'm just going to move this along. Joining us morning from Germany. So we've got Alexandra Tretakov and Nadine Menzel, Leipzig University and the capital of Eichstätt-Ingolstadt, respectively. And they are talking to us about animal poetics in Slavic. Okay, let's go.
So, hi folks. We are both working on cultural animal studies and Slavic literatures, mainly Russian, Ukrainian literary studies, and today I want to present and speak on poetic animals and Slavic literatures. Firstly, give an overview on animal figures in Russian language literature. Secondly, the state of the art of past of human animal studies in Slavic literatures and Slavic studies. And thirdly, we want to talk on philosophical foundations on the example of Russian philosophy. So enjoy the talk.
Thank you. It's our pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Erika. I will start with quotation. I think we still know very little about what animals can do. It has only recently been discovered that fish and marine animals exchange signals underwater. There are also interesting reports about dolphins. Of course, it is not all that simple. The terminology is still in its infancy. Under these conditions, if you try to solve a problem that has to do with the psyche and the potentialities of animals, you are completely lost, says Boris and Arkady Strugatsky's novel Monday Begins on Saturday of 1965. After meeting the talking cat Vasily, the protagonist Alexander Privalov realized that the supposedly advanced Soviet science knows incredibly little about the abilities of animals. He speaks of the inferior position of humans. From today's Russian literature perspective of literary studies, this human-animal understanding seems almost progressive. For even today, Russian language literary studies attach little importance to animals. Animal narratives already occupy a special place in ancient Slavic literatures. The image sketch in Bestiary Physiolog of, for example, here, 13th century, medieval animal poems and treatises were created by means of a complex synthesis of encyclopedic zoological knowledge and poetic, legendary information, partly borrowed from other literatures as well as Christian teachings. In folk tales, violence and fables of the 18th century by Ivan Krylov, we encounter animals mainly as allegorical, mythical creatures with concretely attributed human, predominantly negative character traits. For example, deceitful fox, stupid and clumsy bear, greedy and evil, morally helpful wolf. This allegorical and satirical character of the fable manifests in an artistic way the anthropocentric worldview for which animals are merely masks or illustrations of human mores. In Russian literature of the 19th century, on the other hand, animals are predominantly portrayed as human companions, often suffering from human cruelty, or as anthropomorphic creatures, whereby the authors largely refrain from clear allegorical representation. Lev Tolstoy's Holstamer, Ivan Turgenev's Mumu, or Anton Chekhov's Kashtanka were all names of the animals, as well as dying horses in Fyodor Dostoevsky or Lev Tolstoy can be mentioned as examples. In natural philosophy literature, the theme of hunting occupies an exposed position. Animal suffering, or the question of animals' capacity for suffering, did not lose its importance in literature at the turn of the century. In his stories about dogs, cats, horses, and elephants, Alexander Kupril focuses in particular on the ability of animals to feel and think. In the poetry of the 1920s, an active revision of traditional notions of man and his place in nature begins. This period is further characterized by a particular variety of exotic animal subjects with poetic engagement with the other, becoming a kind of arena for philosophical reflections on the relationship between man and nature. Symbolists used a distinctive apocalyptic animal symbolism, metamorphosis, transformation of man into an animal, or imprisonment of the human spirit in an animal form continues to play a prominent role. Fantastic animal series is further developed in modernity. Mikhail Bulgakov famously creates a particular fantastic zoomorphic series called Behemoth in The Master and Margarita, or Polygraph with Sharikov in The Heart of a Dog. Erika is a wonderful interpretation of this novel. By focusing on environmental issues, the literal landscape of the 1950s till 1980s takes a critical look at the destructive consequences of Soviet economic development, as well as the established attitude regarding the ethics and moral of society. In the moralizing literature of this period, interest in the animal now grows less in the function of a symbol than of a part of the environment to be saved. Among others, Vitaly Bianchi, Sergei Zaligin, Vladimir Astafyev, or Chingiz Aitmatov pursue the eco-critical idea. Postmodernism creates dystopian worlds with animal protagonists, for example, in the novels of Viktor Pelevin, Tatiana Tolstaya, or Vladimir Sorokin, in which a general tendency of contemporary art emerges, critical questioning of human exceptionalism and of anthropomorphism. But where do we stand in 2023 with regard to the question of animal-human relations in Russia? What significance can be attached to nature in literature after February 24th of 2022? Whether a propagandistic instrumentalization of nature can be observed in Russia today. Within the framework of the weekly lesson talks about important things introduced in Russia school on September 1st of 2022, love for the fatherland is to be imparted in every grade. Elementary school students, for example, are offered mandatory exposure to Russia's nature in the form of pictures, text excerpts, and sounds, as well as patriotic songs, thus fostering the feeling of great patriotism. But let's return to literal animals. Also, there's a huge number of literal animal texts, animal reading, as well as the post-colonial perspective of eco-criticism represented by queer studies, gender studies, and cultural literal animal studies have so far played a very minor role in Russian literal studies. For Slavic studies, the class situation is as follows. A relatively large number of studies of Russian literature and culture have been carried out, but most of them are based on research outside Russia. Russian literature is the focus of analysis in three important works from the American and New Zealand sphere. Jane Koslow and Emmy Nelson's anthology, The Other Animals, Ian Halford's The Savage Gaze, and Henrietta Mondry's Political Animals. Also was mentioned the comparative work of German Slavist Dagmar Burkhardt and that of Finnish Russianist Arja Rosenholm and her junior team Mika Perkiomeki and Eva Kuika at the University of Tampere. Among the Russian works, there are many studies of animal motifs or the occurrence of certain animals in the work of one author. Russian studies in the sense of human animal studies or cultural literal animal studies, however, can be counted on one hand. In their essay, A Little Bit of Horse, Anthropological Notes in the Emergence of Animalistics of 2013, Mikhaila and Reshetnikova describes the situation regarding animal studies in Russia as follows. The established conservative system of academic practice do not allow for an invasion of animal scientists willing to seriously rethink their own views on the relationship between humans and other animals or animal not humans, not even in the next 20 years. The state of research on class is similar in contributions from Ukraine. Ukrainian literature and culture itself have only been rudimentary research from animal-sensitive methodologies, although there are isolated contributions on animal reading, which as in other philologies, often overlap with eco-critical issues. In addition, animal figures have been examined in terms of their symbolic and symbolic quality, as well as in mythopoetic contexts. Essays on fundamental social questions are also available. In Western and Southern Slavic studies, here we refer to Polish and Croatian studies. An example, I just say a few words about this discipline. There were already milestones in the development of class. In 2014, Anna Bartsch and Dorota Jagocka organized an international conference in Warsaw, Animal and Their People, and published the contributions a few years later in the anthology Animals and Their People, Connecting East and West in Cultural Animal Studies. In 2015, the interdisciplinary journal Zoofilologica, Polish Journal of Animal Studies, was founded in Katowice. In 2016, Justyna Włodarczyk, she's here, wonderful, and Michał Piotr Pryjegowski published an anthology of the development of the dog-human relationship in Poland, Free Market Dog. In Zagreb, under the direction of Zuzana Marjanic, 9 members of the interdisciplinary research project Cultural Animal Studies, Interdisciplinary Perspectives and Traditional Practices from Croatia, Serbia and Slovenia are researching the role of animals in the world model of Croatian traditional culture.
So that's my task. Yes, so I'm going to focus only on Russian literature as an example. In addition to practical literary analysis of works, cultural and literary animal studies are concerned with theory and method building. So far, the majority of them originate from a Western European tradition of thought. So it's France, it's also Germany. And even if the anthropological core of the thinking seems to be applicable across cultures, the question remains if it takes into account, or whether it takes into account, social historical peculiarities of certain regions, especially regarding the view of animals. This applies first and foremost to Russia, and we've seen it yesterday on Lebanese literature, yes, so historical background, all that stuff. Yeah, this applies first and foremost to Russia. Not only were Russian literature and culture in the 19th and early 20th century founded in a decidedly orthodox milieu, also Russian religious philosophy of the 19th century explicitly sought to distinguish itself from a Western philosophical thought. A continuation of this endeavor takes place through the Soviet period in the 20th century to the present day. So we see it in the overall war in Ukraine now. Following, I will present firstly in short, really short, a few examples how the animal-human connection was sought in Russian philosophy, and secondly, one approach stemming from Russian literary methodology, which can be made fruitful for cultural literary animal studies. In Russian philosophy of the 19th century, as in the Western thinking of Cartesian dualism, the human-animal relationship or relationship of man to nature presents itself in principle as a relationship of fundamental differences. Animals are the other of man. This is presented, for example, by the following 2 thinkers. According to Mikhail Bakunin, he was an anarchist, Russian anarchist, animals are deficient because they have an empty existence. To construct an idea of man, Bakunin made a tripartite division, as you can see here, where the animal is at the bottom and God is at the top. Even if Bakunin in his later years changed the position of man and God in his hierarchy, he became a worldly anarchist by that time and neglected church in a way, animals remained on the lowest place in his thinking. Animals and God serve as a negative foil to define the human. In this affirmation of the anthropological difference lie parallels to Western European thought described, for example, by Giorgio Agamben with his anthropological machine. The Christian philosopher Nikolai Fyodorov even refers beyond the non-human animal to the entire, quote, blindly raging and destructive nature, quote end. In his work, Philosophia Obshevodyela, he requests man to be the corrective of nature and to intervene in nature in a regulating manner. All these ideas of Bakunin and Fyodorov and others based on an othering of the non-human environment or non-human animal, which supports existing hierarchical orders. New Zealand researcher Henrietta Mondry published an interesting interpretation which reveals an example of a different thinking on man and animal in Russian philosophy. Mondry, being an expert on the controversial Russian philosopher Vasily Rozanov, discovers a monistic view on the relationship of man and human in Rozanov's writings. First of all, Rozanov exhibits a positively connoted view on corporeality, where everything corporeal is connected. Rozanov was interested in the study of the bodies through self-perception, observation, and sensing, and doing this, he indirectly criticized practices of the Orthodox Church. He aimed at breaking the boundaries between his own body and the body of the natural and supernatural other, to cross borders between various species like human and animal. He also performed this tripartite division analog to Bakunin, but not in the form of hierarchical developmental steps, but as an equation. In doing this, Mondry argues, Rozanov, quote, destigmatizes the body and equates the physical with the metaphysical. Mondry states that Rozanov, with his thoughts, quote, dismantled a set of binarisms which are inherent in the animal-human dualism. These are self and other, body and mind, flesh and spirit, nature and civilization. Russian philosophical thinking is not only published in tracts, but also can be found in fiction. This is why I want to remark on a Russian author, Lev Tolstoy. You might know him, he's very prominent. Tolstoy can be considered the most prominent pioneer for a different approach to non-human animals. The author, in the course of a personal life crisis, not only started to live vegetarian, but also exhibits a certain animal-sensitive fictional presentation of animals. Around 1884, Tolstoy decided for a vegetarian diet, not least because of ethical aspects regarding animals. His meatless diet is an expression of a renunciation of violence. It's an explicit rejection of violence against animals as he experienced it, for example, in a slaughterhouse in Tula, a Russian town, and wrote down in his essay, Pierwsza stupen, or first step. The fictional presentation of animals in his works is also very special. In the majority of his later prose, he exhibits a harsh criticism of institutional practices of the church, which are, this criticism is centering around the phenomenon of violence. And this violence is mostly connected to animals. The text animals shown in the world are mostly victims of a world corrupted by power. For example, the reflected anthropomorphized horse in Halstemer, we already heard it by Alexandra, which narrates about such a world from an animal perspective. Or another not anthropomorphized horse in Chazyain i Rabotnik, master and servant. This horse also becomes a victim of power constellations in which the naturally intelligent is confronted with human egotism and human profit striving. As these two examples show, Tolstoy principally exhibits a dualistic thinking in the delimited categories of nature versus culture, but in a positive way. It's wise nature versus corrupted culture. Thus, the author affirms a dichotomic thinking which the human-animal studies decidedly reject. Nevertheless, Tolstoy is a practicing animal-sensitive writer, which must be given great attention in the context of the work of cultural literary animal studies, especially in questions of practices within man-animal relationship. On the example of these thinkers, you can see that discourses on animals and animal and men are always connected to other discourses, which are in the forefront. It's not the discourses on animal and men, but discourses about society, about religion. The last point I want to make on a method, and briefly want to talk about Michael Bachtin's, you might know him, concepts of polyphony and dialogicity. I think these concepts are really fruitful for cultural literary animal studies. Martin derives and exemplifies these concepts from the work of Dostoevsky and describes them in full in his work Проблемы поэтики Достоевского. Martin's insights into the conception of a literary figure in Dostoevsky's work concerns the hero's potency to characterize himself via direct speech or inner monologue. By doing this, contemporary discourses become visible. Even if Dostoevsky's work is considered prototypical for Martin's discourse, his method contains potential for fruitful analysis of speaking textual animals outside Dostoevsky's universe. Take, for example, Bulgakov's dog Sharik in Heart of the Dog. Via human language, the dog is in a dialogue with the author, and through character speech or inner monologue, the dog becomes a holistic subject and carrier of certain attitudes and historical knowledge. In summary, cultural literary animal studies, human animal studies, and most of post-colonial approaches are in Russia in its infancy, as Alexandra already said. Talking about cultural animals in Russia, much can be said, much can be found about animals' mythological and folkloristic impact. Principally lacking, and now I come to the wider scope, this also applies to Ukrainian and Belarusian literature. Principally lacking are 3 points. First, it's the foundations. So philosophy and history have to be researched about man-human relationship, about practices, because these outcomes are needed for further research and literary studies. Secondly, further analysis of a substantial corpus of individual analysis of individual works is required with animal-sensitive perspectives. In the main, and we have heard most of them, there are a handful of Russian fictional works which are interpreted in the frame of human animal studies excessively to date. These are novels with animal protagonists such as Turgenev's Mumu, Tolstoy's Khalstamer, Chekhov's Kashtanka, or Bulgakov's Dog Heart, but there are more. Also peripheral ones, peripheral animals. Alexandra and me are currently working on to elaborate these interpretations. Last and not least, comparative studies are needed, and with comparative studies I mean philological comparative, because the question is what are the differences between representation of animals in Russian, French, German, whatever English literature, and if it's possible to draw attention on other things and on everything which is connected to animal and also to human culture, because I think this might be the point where animals are becoming relevant also across the borders of human-animal studies. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Can I take that microphone from you?
Oh, yes, yes. Oh,
Present you with your medal. So our final speaker in this session is Justyna Włodarczyk. Is that close enough? Or did I do
close
it?
enough.
Who is from the University of Warsaw, and she's here to talk on animal studies in Poland from controversy to harmony.
Okay. I'm going to set my timer just to make sure I don't go over time. Okay. I need to begin this presentation with a disclaimer to my Polish friends and colleagues who may listen to the presentation or the recording and feel that some names, dates, facts have been left out. And this is, of course, inevitable, especially as my goal is not to provide a list of who is who and a complete chronology, but to situate the emergence and strengthening of interest in animal studies and the institutional and cultural obstacles encountered along the way within broader trends and changes in Polish society and academia. Many accounts of the development of animal studies have already been written. We know them, tracing the links between activism and academia, laying out the theoretical influences, discussing the field's interdisciplinarity, which is why I would like to focus and what makes the situation in Central Europe and especially Poland unique. I want to tell you a story, but I'm very much aware of the dangers of a single story, and thus I openly acknowledge that this is not an exhaustive account, that my own knowledge is situated. I am based in Poland, though I have not been in Poland throughout the entire period I am describing, and I am an American Studies scholar by training, which complicates my positionality even further. On to the story, though. The first signs of interest in animal studies as a theoretical approach, and the first publications that actually used the term animal studies, or its Polish translation, Studia nad zwierzętami. The issue of translation is significant in itself and will be something I pick up on later, appear in the first years of the 21st century. The year 2009, celebrated as the bicentenary of Charles Darwin's birth, was a significant milestone, as many of the acclaimed Polish humanities journals published special issues that included content ostensibly related to Darwin, but actually utilizing animal studies methodologies. And these are the covers of these early journals or special issues of journals. The events surrounding the celebrations also brought together scholars from the humanities and from the life sciences in ways that later resulted in fruitful interdisciplinary collaborations. These early special issues and edited collections also included translations of usually English language animal studies publications. And even though English is the most popular foreign language in Poland and is widely understood in academic circles, the translations still formed something of a canon of animal studies texts. They included translations of articles or excerpts of books by Donna Haraway, Kerry Wolfe, Kari Vale, Wilkin Lika. Translations can have a huge impact on the shaping of academic discussions. And for example, the publication of Éric Baraty's book, Le Point de Vue Animal, in 2014, from French into Polish, the translation from French into Polish, has had a huge effect on the development of animal studies among Polish historians. And I would venture to say that Baraty is probably better known in Poland than in the English-speaking world. As animal studies was beginning to slowly gain visibility in the academia in the 2000s, it was received as a critical lens imported from the West, largely from English-speaking countries. When in 2011, philosopher and art historian from the Adam Mickiewicz University of Poznań and one of the pioneers of animal studies in Poland, Monika Baki, wrote about the development of animal studies in one of the first attempts in Polish, this is translated from Polish by me, to take stock of the emerging field in an article titled Animal Studies from Activism to Academia and Back. The field she was referring to was situated in the broadly defined West, and she was discussing possibilities for its development in Poland. Baki's position and the general consensus at the time was that interest in animal studies was slowly increasing in Poland, and that the growing interest was, on the one hand, related to more pronounced animal rights activism and the growing concern for animal welfare, but at the same time hampered by this connection, because it made animal studies ideologically entangled, thus increasing some scholars' reluctance to become involved. In 2013, Anna Bartsch, one of the pioneers of literary animal studies in Poland, wrote in a review of one of the first Polish language edited volumes that attempted to apply animal studies and post-humanist perspectives to Polish literature, despite the abundance of foreign literature on the topic, there is still in Poland a lack of books inspired by the very interesting research trends in literary studies and in studies of culture more generally, initiated largely in English-speaking countries. While these diagnoses did not appear particularly controversial and could potentially be applied to other geographical contexts as well, especially the part about trivialization of animal studies research within the broader academia that was in Baki's quote, I would like to draw out how Polish academia is situated in these excerpts as being in the position of lagging behind and needing to catch up with the West. A familiar scenario to both Polish academics and Polish citizens who, especially in the first decades after the political and economic transformation of 1989, were often encouraged to perceive themselves as the perpetual latecomers to various progressive ventures, always on the margins, forever catching up. And I'm not saying this to criticize my colleagues who wrote these words. That is not the case. And I probably would have offered a similar diagnosis at the time, but to prepare the ground for future events. It is interesting that as animal studies became more settled in Polish academia in the second half of the 2010s, and as increasingly more researchers started looking for alternative genealogies, it turned out that such alternative genealogies actually exist. Ones that do not identify the broadly understood, though largely English-speaking West as the only source of both theory that could inform animal studies scholarship and of animal rights activism. Since the time when these early publications proclaimed Poland's delay in adopting animal studies theory, historians have discovered an active 19th century animal rights movement. Turns out that Poland actually had the second society for the protection of animals established in the world. And long forgotten thinkers, often naturalist philosophers, whose ideas are becoming increasingly more popular, not as odd curiosities, but as theoretical influences for the younger generation of animal studies scholars. Still, the influence of Western thinkers on the emergence of animal studies in Poland is undeniable. If one looks at the bibliographies of papers published in the 2010s, but also at the lists of invited guests, keynote speakers, etc. In relation to keynote speakers, I would like to mention two early examples of the institutional obstacles encountered by animal studies scholars, obstacles that were linked to what is euphemistically referred to as the specificity of the Polish cultural context, which really means the strength of conservative public discourse in Poland, and the confluence of factors that led to animal studies being identified as the enemy by this discourse. The first such example is the case of the conference titled Legal and Ethical Aspects of the Humane Protection of Animals, originally scheduled to take place at the Faculty of Law at the University of Warsaw, where I work, in 2010. The event was rescheduled and took place in a private cafe because some speakers backed out of the conference after learning that one of the keynote speakers would be Peter Singer. In a public statement, one of the Polish invited speakers, the rector of another Polish university, explained, "The reason for this decision is the participation of Dr. Peter Singer, whose radical views related to abortion, euthanasia, and sexual ethics I do not support and accept," end of quote. Singer was deemed controversial not because of his views on animal rights, but because of his support for legalizing abortion, an explosive topic in Poland where abortion has been banned since 1993. Still, the situation placed the topic of animal rights in academic animal studies through its connection to animal rights activism firmly within the debate on academic freedom of speech and also firmly within the culture wars. The discourse of catching up with the West and adopting new trends, one which defined Polish public life after the 1989 systemic transformation, is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, for those who subscribe to it, it has a tendency to create and strengthen feelings of inferiority that can only be overcome through hard work and effort, and even then, the stage of finally catching up with the West dooms as an illusory and far-fetched goal. Because of this double bind, we have to work hard, and no matter how hard we work, we will never be Western, to pun once again on our "we will never be human" diagnosis. The discourse generates significant opposition. Among those who oppose it, the discourse of catching up with the West is seen as a strategy of colonization. These new trends are seen as antithetical to Polish traditions and arrogant in their desire to introduce new and better paradigms of thinking. This hostile attitude to discourses perceived as Western inventions was first and most thoroughly analyzed in relation to the emergence of feminism. Already in 2001, Agnieszka Graf argued that the emergence of a feminist movement in Poland after 1989 was, and to an extent continues to be, perceived as a foreign imposition upon Polish society. In the early 2000s, feminism was perceived, using the conservatives' vocabulary, as the West's strategy for destroying Polish society and Polish families. Despite controversies, gender studies did become institutionalized quite quickly. A postgraduate certificate program began to be offered by the University of Warsaw in 1996. It became a popular field for many young academics in the early 2000s. In a 2009 article about the possibilities of using animal studies in history, the author Katarzyna Nowak, in addition to conveying her optimism about the potential animal studies has to redefine history as a discipline, expressed her befuddlement with the lack of interest in animal studies as compared to the growing interest in gender studies, which, open quote, is transforming into one of the dominant perspectives in academic history, close quote. It is the comparison to gender studies that has, for better or worse, come to define animal studies as an academic field, but more importantly, its reception by the general public in Poland. Public discourse in the first and second decade of the 2000s was marked by a campaign by conservative media and Catholic thinkers against what they termed as gender ideology or genderism. It was no longer just feminism that was to blame for the dissolution of Polish families and the falling birth rate, but a wider confluence of forces that threatened Polish national identity. The reason why I mentioned this so-called war on gender, and this is the quote really that I have been showing all along, but that's its time in the presentation. The reason why I mentioned the so-called war on gender is because it coincided with the increased visibility of animal studies in Polish media in 2014. This visibility was related to a large international animal studies conference that was organized by, and that was mentioned by my colleagues who spoke before me, Institute of Literary Research of the Polish Academy of Sciences by Anna Barcz and Dorota Łagodzka, who in 2012 received a grant from the National Center for Science, the major funding body for scientific research in Poland, titled The Importance of Animal Studies for Cultural Studies in Poland. The conference was an element of their grant activities. However, the strong media presence of the large and international conference sparked some controversy, which has to be viewed within the larger framework of social issues in Poland, especially the campaign against genderism. Announcements about the conference resulted in critical articles in conservative media. Ronda.pl, a right-wing magazine and web portal, proclaimed, "Gender is nothing, here comes animal studies," and accompanied this headline with an image of a headless human figure of an undetermined gender cradling a puppy. The implications of the photo and the text suggest that animal studies, through its evaluation of the human-animal bond, is contributing to a decline in women's childbearing rates caused by a transference of their maternal instinct onto pets. Falling birth rates in industrial countries are routinely diagnosed as an element of the so-called civilization of death in Poland. Not surprisingly, some of the articles in the conservative press brought up the possibility of bestiality being the logical result of animal studies' interest in exploring non-human subjectivity and rethinking species difference. The organizers of the conference responded with well-intentioned and honest attempts to present animal studies as a legitimate field of academic scholarship, and even cited examples of religious studies research in animal studies. But such defenses fall on deaf ears in contexts where it's the polarization of values that is a desired goal, not the careful and open-minded exploration of potential points of connection. These are the two publications that resulted from that conference. And I just wanted to mention that in a way, these two books are also exemplary of the kind of double bind that animal studies scholars in Poland are in. The one on the left, published in Polish, is one that operates within Polish animal studies discourse. It's cited, it lives, people read it. And then you have the other one, Animals and Their People, the one published in English. I don't think anybody has ever cited this book. So the bind is, in a way, either you publish in Polish and you're local and you're recognized by your peers who speak Polish, or you publish in English and you're the person with the strange last name that nobody can pronounce, who ends up not getting cited. To sum up this section of the presentation, animal studies met with its share of institutional and social obstacles that were somewhat different than in other places in the world because of Poland's recent political and economic transformation, which resulted in polarizing society around notions of technological and social progress and around moral issues. Through its association with animal rights activism and the very explicit link to feminism and gender studies, animal studies became demonized, though also visible outside the academia. These links, as we all know, do exist, but in this case, they were exacerbated, simplified, and vulgarized through their incorporation into non-academic public discourse that borders on hate speech. This popular backlash directed against animal studies has diminished in recent years, not because the character of the public debate has changed, but because new enemies have been chosen as more worthy targets. I would now like to move on from the ideological debates and institutional obstacles to the achievements of animal studies. accomplished despite these difficulties, and to current trends among animal studies scholars. I have 4 minutes to do this, so let me be quick. If the field's legitimacy within the academia is measured through factors such as degree programs, centers, chairs, etc., then yes, then these should be listed. In 2011, Monika Baki foresaw an institutional future for animal studies in Poland. And as it turned out, her words were prophetic, because a program offering a BA degree in anthropozoology took off at the University of Warsaw in 2017, in the fall of 2017. This degree program is the result of the collaboration of 3 faculties: liberal arts, or artes liberales, biology, and psychology. The program is highly interdisciplinary and includes subjects such as zoology and ethology, physiology of animals, basic genetics, the biological and cultural mechanisms of animal domestication, but also sociology of human-animal relations, animals in literature, animals in art. While the opening of the program did meet with some criticism in the conservative press, where the word pseudoscience was used as a keyword, it is proving popular among students, and there are already some graduates. The name of the course of studies, anthropozoology, was chosen deliberately over other possible options, which included simply animal studies or human animal studies, so retaining the English phrasing, and this has been done in the case of gender studies, which operates as gender studies, and using the Polish translations, Studia nad zwierzętami, the most accurate and literal translation of animal studies, but unfortunately this one situates animals as a grammatical object and creates associations of passivity, objectification. Another milestone is the creation of the journal, it's a website of Anthropozoologia, is the creation of the journal Zoofilologica, or the Polish Journal for Animal Studies. In 2015, Justyna Tymieniecka-Suchanek, a Russian studies scholar from the University of Silesia, initiated the publication of this journal, and it serves as a platform of interdisciplinary debate for animal studies scholars and is published in 3 languages, Polish, English, and Russian. It is open to and includes publications by scholars from the life sciences. This is Gabriela Jarzembowska's text about the journal Zoofilologica and Animal Studies in Poland. It's a relatively recent text, 2019, and I consider Gabriela to be a super brilliant and a scholar of the younger generation. But the reason why I'm showing this particular quote is because her words extend beyond the significance of Zoofilologica as a journal and circle back to the topic of Polish scholars' feelings and experiences of marginalization. It seems that the discourse surrounding animal studies in Poland has shifted. We have moved from the impossible narrative of trying to catch up to one which is less concerned with reproducing or complementing Western animal studies discourses and more preoccupied with discussing the conditions of its own possibility. Already in its name, Zoofilologica refers to a term that was introduced by Polish literary scholar Alexander Nawarecki in 2011, zoophilology, to add to John's list of terms that he opened with yesterday, to propose a strategy of reading literature that seeks out animal voices. I mean, that's the meaning of the term. And of course, it refers to the popularity of the term philology as the study of both literature and languages in Central and Eastern Europe. This is visible, what I'm talking about is visible, especially in the work of the younger generation of scholars who do not see themselves as knocking on the doors of Western academia, but who are engaged in creating their own paradigms for research. Younger generation scholars, even though they're also operating in the same conservative social context, are at least relatively free from the need of justifying their research interests in the academia. If anything, my fears are that some take on topics related to animal studies not because of a genuine interest in non-humans, but because animal studies within the academia is seen as an increasingly popular research lens. I may be wrong here, and I hope I am. Still, it is a fact that a significant percentage of doctoral projects submitted last year to the University of Warsaw's Doctoral School for the Humanities were either directly related to animal studies or to the broader environmental humanities. And I would love to say that animal studies in the Polish academia have reached a state of harmony, but the only reason why this word is used in the title of this presentation is because it is used in the title of a grant project through which I have funded my visit. So I had to use it, and yeah, and I'm explaining it towards the end because nobody's going to listen towards the end, even if there's a recording. I mean, my funders. But I'd say But I'd say the relationship status between animal studies, Polish academia and Polish society continues to be complicated. And an additional complication is the emergence of the environmental humanities as the new cool thing in the humanities. So for example, the University of Warsaw this year has established an environmental humanities center, which is very well funded through some extra money that the university received from the Ministry of Education for groundbreaking interdisciplinary research and so on. And within, okay, so it exists, but it is environmental humanities and not animal studies. And I can say I have to finish, so thank you very much.